Hi class, in this last video for this chapter, we are going to start talking about stereotypes and attributions. Swim and Sana analyzed more than 50 experiments and found that there was a consistent gender effect. If it was successful on a task, people attributed his success to natural ability. If a woman was successful, they attributed it to hard work because obviously that woman did not have natural ability. So if she did well, it's because she worked for it. If a man failed on a task, they attributed it to bad luck or low effort because obviously he had the ability. And if a woman failed, they attributed it to the task being just too hard for her little lady brain. She just didn't have the ability level for it. For Jacobs and Eccles, in their experiment, they found that mothers who had the strongest stereotypic gender beliefs also believed that their own daughters had lower math ability than their sons, and that their sons had significantly higher math ability. So they applied these stereotypes to their own children. And their daughters also came to believe that they were not good at math. Those prejudiced mothers passed their stereotypes on to their own kids. Women without that stereotype didn't think that their daughters were worse at math, and their daughters didn't think that either. A related concept is attributional ambiguity. This is a phenomenon whereby members of a stigmatized group have a difficulty in interpreting feedback on their work or actions. So, question for you connected with this. In an experiment, Harbour had white college students read and evaluate poorly written essays that were supposedly written by other students enrolled in a writing workshop. Half of the time, they thought that the author of this bad essay was white. Half of the time, they thought the author was black. So my question for you is, who received harsher feedback from the white participants? All the participants were white. Was it the white authors or was it the black authors? It was the white authors. Evaluators went out of their way to say positive things about what was in the black writers' essays, even though they were bad essays. No one had written a good essay. This isn't a good thing, going out of your way to try to find good things to say just because the author is black. Because how are those black writers in this workshop going to improve if they can't get honest feedback? And so that's where this attributional ambiguity comes in. When those authors are reading the reviews of their essays, they're thinking, is this because of my race or is this because of my actual ability? Is this really what they think about my essay, or are they just saying this because of my race? One way that this attributional ambiguity can be negative, and not just for the specific people that are in it, is because of, for example, affirmative action programs, which can have a lot of really great benefits. Full disclosure, I am pro affirmative action, but one unintended consequence is that the people who are connected to the groups that are assisted through affirmative action programs can be stigmatized. They help people, and so the assumption can be, did you get this thing because you deserved it, or just because of your race, your gender, what group you fit in? There's that ambiguity there that is unfair for the people that get that job, get into that school. Other people will doubt whether it was just their ability or some other factor that helped get them in. Turner and Pracanis did an experiment with this for gender. They led some women to believe that they had been selected for a job because the company needed to hire more women. It was an affirmative action thing. Other participants were told that they got the job because they did really well on a difficult test, and so it was their high performance that got them hired. The women who were selected because of their gender, compared to the women who were selected because of their merit, denigrated their own abilities more and were more likely to stop trying as hard to succeed on a difficult task. They were wondering, am I really up to this, or did I just get hired because of my gender and not because I can actually do this job? This connects with the self-fulfilling prophecy. When we hold beliefs about others, the self-fulfilling prophecy ensures that we are going to create a social reality that lines up with our expectations. If we assume, this isn't just specific forms of prejudice. If we think someone is standoffish and distant, and we see them at a party, we're going to act cold to them because we assume we're not going to like them. They're going to pick up on that vibe, and how are they going to act? They're going to act more distant and aloof because they're getting that vibe that you don't like them. You create the reality you assume is there. So for when this applies to yourself, it's the stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is an apprehension experienced by members of a minority group that they might confirm an existing cultural stereotype. This can affect you in a lot of different ways, especially with intellectual performance. So, for example, in Steele and Aronson's experiment, they gave a difficult verbal test to Black and to white college students. Half of the students were told that the investigators were interested in measuring their intellectual ability. Half of the participants were told that the researchers were only interested in testing the test. They didn't really care about actually evaluating the participants. For the white students, it did not matter what they were told. They all performed about the same on the test. However, for the Black students, if they were told that this is a test of your intelligence, and there is a stereotype that if you are Black, you are not as smart, those Black participants scored half as well as the Black participants who were told that it was just a test of the test. Their anxiety from thinking that their performance might prove that negative stereotype about race and intelligence led them to have a worse performance, and then led to them getting a lower test score on this intelligence test. That is that stereotype threat. Your anxiety that you are going to prove this negative thing right makes it more likely that you will prove that negative thing right. For Aronson's other experiment connected with this, because this connects with a bunch of different types of prejudice. They had white male engineering students who all had scored almost perfect on their math SAT scores. They took a math test. The experimenters told them that they were trying to understand why Asians appear to be better at math than white people. So now they've got this thought in their head, oh my goodness, I'm going to prove this stereotype that white people aren't as smart in math as Asian people. What happened was they were thinking about that prejudice and it hurt their scores. They did worse on the test than the white male students who were not reminded of that stereotype that they are a part of. For the McGlone and Aronson experiment, what they did was they reminded participants that they were students at a highly selective school before they took a spatial intelligence test. When they did that, they completely eliminated a gender difference compared to a control group where the female participants taking the spatial test were not reminded that they were part of this really smart group. For those female participants who were not thinking about the stereotype, the students at this school are smart, they were thinking about the stereotype, women aren't as good at spatial ability, they did worse. If they were connecting with the stereotype, people at this school are really smart, they didn't do worse. That was what they were focusing on. Stereotype threat works like other threats to your self-concept, basically. It can be buffered by focusing on positive aspects of yourself. I'm a student at a good school, and that can help counteract the negative effects of the stereotypes on your performance and learning. And again, this connects with lots of different types. One experiment your book does not talk about was with the stereotype of the dumb jock. So you have this assumption, if you're a student athlete, you're not as smart. And so they gave student athletes a test. Half of the time, they said, this is an intelligence test. So those athletes are thinking, oh my goodness, I'm going to prove the dumb jock stereotype right. Half the time, they told the participants that it was a test of something like athletic knowledge. Jocks are supposed to be better at that. There were significant differences in how these student athletes scored based on whether they thought it was about their intelligence or their athletic knowledge, even though for all the participants, it was the exact same test. This stereotype threat can connect with any type of stereotype. Next thing to go over is blaming the victim, which Mel Lerner created. And this is the tendency to blame victims for their victimization. So you attribute their predicaments to their own personalities, their flaws. This blaming the victim is often motivated by a desire to see the world as fair. This is connected to that just world thinking. If you think the world is fair, then if something bad happens, that person must have brought it on themselves. And so oftentimes if someone is the victim of discrimination, we want to somehow blame them for what happened. So question I have for you, can you think of an example where based on someone being the victim of discrimination, we tend to blame them for what happened, we tend to blame the victim? I'll give you one example of this. One example of this is a disproportionate number of Black males are the victims of police violence in our country. And after something happens, after a Black man is killed by the cops, oftentimes one of the first things you will hear is, why didn't you just comply? If you had just complied, this wouldn't happen. You would not be dead. That is that blaming the victim. It is somehow you did this to yourself. And it's partly we want to think the world is fair. It's partly based on our own experience. That's not how it works. A cop has never tried to hurt me. So it must be something about you that has led a cop to hurt you. It's easier to justify what happens if we can say it is the victim's fault. Next, final big thing we're going to go over is, now that we've talked about what causes a lot of this discrimination, is how to reduce prejudice. So we're going to talk about a couple of different techniques. One hypothesis is the contact hypothesis. The contact hypothesis says once prejudiced people encounter real human beings rather than stereotypes, you're going to have greater mutual understanding and friendship. So a way to decrease prejudice is through direct contact. So, for example, if you want to decrease prejudice in school, you need to integrate schools. If you have an integrated school, you're not going to have prejudice anymore because they'll get to know each other. Deutsch and Collins did an experiment with this. They examined the attitudes of white Americans towards Black Americans in 2 public housing projects. In one of them, white and Black families had been randomly assigned to separate buildings in the same project. So they did not live in the same buildings together. In the other project, Black and white families lived in the same buildings. You were randomly assigned within the same building. After several months, white residents in the integrated housing reported a greater positive change in their attitudes towards their Black neighbors than residents who were in the segregated housing. Even though they didn't choose if they lived in the integrated or segregated housing, if they were in the integrated housing, they had decreased prejudice. So contact with diverse neighbors decreases your prejudice towards the groups those neighbors are a part of. In another experiment Sedanius did, what they found was that minority students who joined ethnic student organizations, so that's decreasing contact, tended to develop stronger ethnic identity and pride, but they also tended to develop an increased sense of ethnic victimization. They wanted to be more separate from these other groups. Students in white sororities developed feelings that they have less in common with other ethnic groups than students who were in diverse sororities. If you're only around your type of people, you're going to be more prejudiced than if you're in a more diverse group. When people's prejudices are largely based on unfamiliarity with another group, contact is a good way to decrease that discomfort of not knowing how to behave, what to say. But the contact, if that contact is going to reduce prejudice, it has to take place in a situation where you have equal status. Equal status is essential for the contact hypothesis to work. So for example, in Stevens' experiment, they looked at schools after desegregation, so after the schools were integrated, and Stevens found that there were no studies indicating a significant increase in self-esteem among Black students. And there was not a significant decrease in prejudice. 25% of the Black students actually showed a significant drop in their self-esteem following desegregation. So in that situation, the contact hypothesis did not work. It did not lead to decreased prejudice, increased positive feelings for the minority group because it was not equal status. The Black children in the school were not at equal footing after desegregation with the white students, so the contact hypothesis did not work. One way to decrease prejudice is to ensure that equal status. You have to have interdependence. That is when people need each other to succeed. So a couple of examples of this. Sharif, who did the Robbers Cave experiment, after he got the boys to hate each other, the Eagles and the Rattlers, one way he got them to decrease the prejudice to like each other again was to create situations where they could only succeed through that interdependence with working together. So for example, he set up an emergency situation where he damaged the water supply system and it could only be repaired if the boys cooperated together. Or he had the camp truck break down while the boys were on a camping trip and they had to pull it up a steep hill, and the only way to get it up the hill is if both groups worked together. So that interdependence helped to decrease the prejudice, helped to decrease the hate between the groups. Deutsch showed that problem-solving groups are friendlier and more attentive when you have a cooperative, interdependent environment rather than a competitive one. A big way you see this in schools is through the jigsaw classroom. This is a cooperative classroom structure designed to reduce ethnic, race, and gender prejudice and to raise the self-esteem and confidence of children by having them work in small, racially mixed cooperative groups. The jigsaw classroom was created by Aronson's research team in Texas. They were brought in to help after there was a lot of racial conflict in the school post-desegregation. And so the way these classrooms are set up, you have a group that is diverse that has to work together, so small groups within the classroom. Each kid in the group is given one chunk of information that's going to be on a test. They teach that information to the other kids in their group. In order to do well on the test, you have to learn from everyone in your group. You can't only use your information. And so if you are prejudiced against someone else in your group and you're just going to ignore them, you're screwing yourself over. You're not going to do well. And these kids want to do well in school. So they are forced to listen to each other. They are forced to create an environment where the other kids in their group feel comfortable sharing their information that they are trying to teach. If all you're going to do is mock another student and be cruel to another student, that's not an environment where that student is going to teach you everything you need to know. So these jigsaw classrooms lead to better performance on exams. The students like each other more. They like school more. They have higher self-esteem. They don't skip school as much. And you have less prejudice and stereotyping. Jigsaw classrooms are really beneficial. And a big part of this is because you are required to build empathy in this jigsaw classroom. You have to understand the perspective of the other kids in your group to help create an environment where you can all learn together, because you all have to succeed together. So last thing for the Bridgman experiment, what he did is he had 10-year-old kids, half of them as participants, half of them had been in a jigsaw classroom for 2 years, half of them were not in a jigsaw classroom. And then he showed them a cartoon. In the cartoon, it showed a little boy looking sad as he waved goodbye to his dad in an airport before his dad got on a plane. So he's sad his dad left on a plane. In the next panel, a package arrives for the boy. And then in the final panel, he's opened the toy plane and he is crying. The kids are asked what the mailman who brought the package would think when he sees this boy crying at the sight of a toy plane. Now, if you are a kid with high empathy, you can put yourself in the mailman's shoes. You can understand the mailman's perspective. The mailman would be confused. Like, this kid just got a nice toy. Why is he crying? A kid who doesn't have high empathy would understand or would say, the mailman knows he's sad that his dad left on the plane. That's why he's crying at the toy. The mailman wouldn't know that. He's just the mailman. Like, he doesn't know where the kid's dad is that he left on a plane. So if you don't have empathy, you can't understand what the mailman is thinking. If you do have it, you'd understand, you'd know the mailman was confused. The kids who had been in the, who were not in the jigsaw classroom were more egocentric. They thought the mailman would understand why the boy was crying. The kids who were in the jigsaw classroom were able to take that mailman's perspective because that's something they had learned in their class, and they were able to understand that the mailman would be confused about why the boy was crying at the nice toy. Once you have to work every day in school to understand where someone else is coming from, to understand other people's perspectives, it is more difficult to lose that empathy. And so it's more difficult to be prejudiced against those people, to bully them, because it's easier to understand how that would make them feel, where they're coming from. So jigsaw classrooms are a great way in school to decrease prejudice, which will hopefully continue after those kids are out of school. And that is it for this chapter.